Good afternoon and good evening, everyone, for those of you who are joining us from across the country. Yes, glad that you are here. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the 2022 Mary Milligan R.S.H.M. Lecture on Spirituality, featuring Professor Kwok Pui Lan, speaking on planetary spirituality for our time. My name is Dr. Kim Harris, and I'm a professor here at Loyola Marymount University in the Department of Theological Studies. My colleagues and I are honored each year to host this lecture in memory of Mary Milligan, Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, who served as a professor of theological studies, a provost, and a dean here at LMU. To further welcome you today and to introduce our speaker, I'm pleased to introduce the president of Loyola Marymount University, Timothy Law Snyder. President Snyder has been a champion of Jesuit education for more than 30 years. Under President Snyder's bold leadership, LMU seeks to create the world we want to live in through inclusivity, creativity, and by extending our global reach with impact. Guided by the university's mission, President Snyder inspires the community to pursue new heights of excellence, as evidenced by our record-setting enrollments, exceeding our fundraising goal, and our reclassification as a Carnegie R2 doctoral university. LMU leads the way as a top 5 Jesuit university and a top 5 national university in Southern California, and that's according to U.S. News and World Report. And we're very happy and excited about having a chapter of Phi Beta Kappa, the nation's oldest and most prestigious academic honor society, and to expanding our university's leadership in diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racist programs. In addition, we have key infrastructure additions at this time, and those include the Drollinger Family Stage, the Howard B. Fitzpatrick Pavilion, and a third LMU campus in Playa Vista. Please join me in welcoming President and Professor Timothy Law Snyder.
Thank you, Professor Harris. My gratitude abounds for the collaboration of the Marymount Institute Press and the Department of Theological Studies in producing this lecture series and, of course, its accompanying publication. I thank the Milligan Lecture Committee, that's Chair Kim Harris, along with committee members Professors Layla Kirst, Teresia DeVroom, Amir Hussein, and Ms. Faith Sylvia. Each of us is indebted to the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary and the Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange for their generosity, compassion, and creativity, each of which energize our LMU community every day. How about a round of applause for our sisters? Thank you. And I thank each of you for joining us to celebrate the legacy of Sister Mary Milligan and her luminous insights, which synthesized her love for critical reflection on spirituality in service of the church and the world with the charism of the R.S.H.M. community, that all may have life. Through this annual gathering, we are inspired to open our minds to see things differently, to question all we may know. With our perspectives broadened, be it through our scholarship, our daily work, or our activism, each of us has the gift of experiencing and contributing to the infinite wonder of our universe. Which brings me to Professor Kwok Pui Lan and her exquisite writing on a topic so timely and essential to healing this place, our common home. Planetary Spirituality for Our Time explores how planetary consciousness impacts our thinking of spirituality and Christian life. With loving vigor, she invites us to expand our definition of spirituality, to view our relationship with God as inextricably linked to the planetary processes. As such, she takes us on a journey through perspectives and principles that address the ecological crises amidst us. Professor Kwok's lecture is a passionate call to action for people of all faith traditions to learn from one another and to be in communion with each of the earth's inhabitants, indeed, with the very earth itself. So I am pleased, I am excited to introduce the visionary mind behind such exquisite scholarship. Since 2020, Kwok Pui Lan has graced Emory's Candler School of Theology as Dean's Professor of Systematic Theology. Previously serving at Emory as the school's Distinguished Visiting Professor of Theology for the 2017-18 and 2018-19 academic years, she was named Faculty Person of the Year by the student body both years. Dr. Kwok is the former William F. Cole Professor of Christian Theology and Spirituality at Episcopal Divinity School. She also taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Auburn Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary, and the Yale Divinity School. Professor Kwok's research focuses on Asian feminist theology and post-colonial theology, and she's written or edited over 20 books. These include Post-Colonial Politics and Theology, The Hong Kong Protests and Political Theology, Occupy Religion, Theology of the Multitude, Post-Colonial Imagination and Feminist Theology, Introducing Asian Feminist Theology, Discovering the Bible in the Non-Biblical World, and Chinese Women and Christianity, 1860 to 1927. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kwok Pui Lan to LMU for this year's Milligan Lecture.
Good afternoon. I am so honored to be invited to deliver this year's Milligan Lecture to honor the legacy of Sister Mary Milligan, educator, spiritual leader, and visionary. July 2021 was the hottest month recorded in 142 years of history. Heat waves stretch across the Pacific Northwest, in North America, and in other parts of the world. Severe weather, fires, floods, and rising sea levels have threatened the livelihood of many peoples. As we have entered the Anthropocene age, in which human activities have significant impacts on the planet's climate and ecosystems, churches and faith communities have important roles to play to transform moral values, change consumerist patterns, advocate policy changes, foster international collaboration, and shape a green culture. In his encyclical, Laudato Si, Pope Francis appeals for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet, as environmental crises require a new and universal solidarity. In the book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, historian Dipesh Chakrabarty points out that humans are at the conjunction of three different histories, whose events are defined by very different timescales. The history of the planet, the history of life on the planet, and the history of the globe, made by the logics of empires, capital, and technology. The concept of the planetary challenges Christians to expand our customary reference points to think about our embeddedness in the planetary processes, the evolution of origins of life, our kinship with other animals, and our dependence on innumerable organisms for basic survival. In this Milligan lecture, I want to discuss the contours of planetary spirituality and several practices that will be helpful to address the ecological crisis of our time. I want to adopt a very broad definition of spirituality because many people think of spirituality as our relationship with God without considering how we are embedded in the planetary processes. I would define spirituality as that dimension of the human subject, by virtue of which the person is capable of integrating the body, mind, and spirit, of maintaining just and right relations with other human and non-human species, and of communion with the divine and the whole cosmos. So I want to name the first spiritual practice as reading the Bible with an expansive vision. Many Christians have read the Bible anthropocentrically, placing humans at the centers of the biblical drama. For them, the creation stories in Genesis place humans at the apex of creation because they are created in the image of God. Adam names all animals and thus establishes dominion over them. God has planned all of this for the benefit of humans. To counter this usual anthropocentric interpretation of the Bible, a group of scholars in the Earth Bible Project has advocated reading the Bible from the Earth's perspective. They have developed eco-justice principles to guide this project, which emphasizes the intrinsic worth of the Earth and all its components, for each part belongs to a dynamic cosmic design. Now, reading the Bible from the Earth's perspective enables us to hear a much bigger story. For example, Norman Harbaugh offers a fascinating reading of Genesis 1 as a literary text in which the Earth is the central character or subject, not human beings. In the beginning, the primordial states of the Earth, hidden and lying beneath the waters, is bare and uninhabited, and silently awaits manifestation. God creates light in the primordial darkness so that the Earth can be revealed and made visible. God separates the waters and creates a dome or canopy so that the Earth can be revealed. The bare land is activated and summoned by God to come alive. It puts forth plants with seeds to enable regeneration and all kinds of fauna and flora. The introduction of human beings, however, brings tension to this story. The human story introduces hierarchy, control, and domination. As the Genesis story moves from the revelation of the earth as a geophany to the earth being subdued by humans, it challenges us to think if the earth can be redeemed or will it continue to be under human control. This subversive reading of the Bible through the earth's perspective will nurture a spiritual awareness that we as humans are not at the center and assist us in developing a new relationship with God and the rest of creation. The biblical story of Job gives us a good example. As Job loses his properties, offsprings, and personal health, he challenges divine justice and demands an answer from God. God answers out of the whirlwind. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? The book of Job does not give a direct answer to the centuries of inquiries of why innocent people suffer. Yet it offers a new perspective of praising human pain and suffering within the majestic, everlasting, and immensity of God's ever-presence in the whole created order. As a result, Job's stance is reoriented, and he says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes sees you. Reading the Bible with an expansive vision requires a self-emptying, a change of heart and mind, because humans are no longer at the center, but are only a small part of the complex scheme of God's creation. The earth exists long before us and has its own purpose and reflects God's glory. Salvation is not meant for humans alone, but for the restoration of beauty and goodness that God has meant for creation. Even in the midst of ecological calamity, we are asked to work with God, to birth something new, and to imagine as grand as a new heaven and new earth. The second spiritual practice is learning wisdom interreligiously. Christians have to be open to learning from other cultural and religious traditions, which have much to teach us about planetary awareness and action. As a theologian from a Chinese background, I have learned from and inhabited different religious and cultural universes, a process that enables me to see our world from different vantage points. I remember many years ago, I visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. After passing through galleries upon galleries of huge oil paintings of European masters, which featured human beings as the central subject matter, I came to the Asian wing of the museum, and the contrast could not have been greater. The scrolls hanging on the walls depicted huge mountains and the vast cosmos. And if humans were present, they were simply specks in the natural order. The Neo-Confucian philosopher Zheng Zai, who lived in the 11th century, famously said, "Heaven is my father, and the earth is my mother. And even such a small creature as I find an intimate place in their midst." Zhang's affirmation of the kinship of all beings can find an echo across time and space in St. Francis of Assisi, especially in his Canticle of the Sun. In this canticle, St. Francis praises God for all the creatures, including Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Wind, Sister Water, Brother Fire, Sister Mother Earth, and even Sister Bodily Death. Throughout the ages, Canticle of the Sun has inspired artists, composers, songwriters, mystics, and environmentalists of all kinds. The assumption that Christianity says all the truths is not only hubris, but has also led to the cultural imperialism and violence that we have seen time and again. Today, facing our environmental crisis, we can ill afford to lose sight of what other philosophical and spiritual traditions have to offer and learn from one another. John Tatamolil, a comparative theologian, writes, and I quote, "In an older era, a person was accounted wise if he or she attained a practical mastery of one tradition. Think St. Francis of Assisi. But our age requires also, not instead of, a new kind of wisdom. The capacity to see the world through more than one set of religious lens and to integrate into one life, insofar as possible, what is disclosed through those lenses. Think Mahatma Gandhi. His theory and practice of nonviolent resistance integrated ideas and practices drawn from Jainism, Christianity, especially Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and of course, Hinduism. End of quote. Seeking interreligious wisdom opens the possibility for a spirituality that is expansive and not restricted to only one worldview, but finds spiritual sustenance and support from more than one tradition. As nature is not denigrated in Asian and indigenous cultures when compared to Greek philosophy that influenced so much of Christian theology, Asian philosophy, art, and poetry open spaces to read the Bible from different lenses and appreciate theological traditions that are more in tune with modern scientific and evolutionary worldviews. So the third spiritual practice, and this is lamentation. Climate change has already caused the death of many lives and destroyed livelihoods and properties. Across the globe, many climate refugees are forced to flee from their homelands because of disasters and climate events. The African countries are hard hit by environmental deterioration. Since many Africans depend on agriculture for their livelihood, climate disaster leaves them no choice but to flee and find refuge in other places. Climate change has also exacerbated wars, conflicts, and violence in the continent. While we mourn the human loss and devastation, we cannot lose sight of a worsening biodiversity crisis that threatens a million species with extinction, many within decades. At a time like ours, we can recall the ancient practice of lament in the Bible, because laments help people release their pain and mourn their tragedy. Laments in the Bible represent a very rich depository of spiritual resources because they express the Hebrew people's wrestling with faith and meaning, both individually and communally, out of the depth of loss and suffering. This genre can be found in the Book of Lamentations, in about 1/3 of the entire Book of Psalms, and many of the prophetic words. Women also play a role, as women were official mourners of the people. The Book of Psalms contains a large number of individual and communal laments. Lament psalms addressed God and contained a complaint, such as, "O Lord, God of hosts, how long will you be angry with your people's prayers?" as in Psalm 80. Some of them express deep contrition of heart. It is helpful to see that there is a wide range of human emotions expressed towards God in biblical laments. Some laments demand an answer from God. Some question why God remains silent in the midst of suffering, while others express trust in God and certainty of deliverance. The communal laments were recited and incorporated into religious practices and rituals of the Jewish community. When we we claim this tradition of lament to mourn the calamity, suffering, and tribulation of both human and non-human species. We will contribute to the development of a planetary spirituality. Some churches and religious leaders have encouraged readers to write modern-day laments following the pattern of lament psalms, which generally include the following elements: the introductory cry, complaint or lament, confession of trust, request for help and deliverance, and thanksgiving and praise. We can encourage members of our congregations or students to compose these laments and recite them at public events about the environment or at the feast days of St. Francis, Hildegard of Bingen, and Julian of Norwich, and other worship services. So I come to my last spiritual practice, faithful action. Planetary awareness and lamentation set our minds and hearts to faithful action in solidarity with all creation on earth. With an expansive time scale in mind, our action is responsible not only to our generation, but to future generations. Native Americans remind us that we have to think about our accountability to 7 generations after us. Faithful action means that we bring the moral values of our religious traditions to bear in our individual and communal actions. For Christians living in the United States, faithful action begins with examining our way of life and consumption patterns. For the US has about 5% of the world's population, but consumes nearly 30% of the world's resources. Laudato Si provides further impetus for the Church to undertake international and local efforts to respond to what Pope Francis has called climate emergency. Laudato Si builds on 25 years of papal attention to ecology and climate change as moral issues. It encourages concrete actions from developing a new style to curb consumerism, education and conscientization about ecological citizenship, and cultivating a spirituality of humility, to advocacy and political actions that defend the environment and fight for the common good. In the US, some Catholic churches have turned to solar energy and created creation care teams in parishes to reduce waste and energy consumption to limit their CO2 footprint. Within the Protestant circle, the World Council of Churches has encouraged member churches to work together for justice, peace, and integrity of creation since the 1970s. Indian feminist theologian Aruna Nanadasan, who worked for the WCC, writes, "We have caused and continue to cause violence to the earth, and thus to the body of God, through our careless disregard of the gifts of creation." She points out that colonial Christianity has undermined some of the indigenous practices of prudent care, such as the preservation of sacred trees and sacred groves. It is imperative, she says, to recover some of these traditions and insights, and learned especially from women from the Global South, who are mediators and caretakers of the earth, and who have resisted and fought against the onslaught of creation in order to provide for themselves and their families. The pandemic has pointed to the urgent need for global collaboration in facing global crisis. As the pandemic has disproportionately affected vulnerable populations, the burden of climate change is also borne by poor communities with little access to political and social power. The young Swedish activist Greta Thunberg has called for urgent action and lamented that politicians and governments have acted too slowly. The younger generation is asking us to change our moral value and act decisively to avert the impending calamity. The Russian invasion of Ukraine once again shows us how war, militarism, conflict, and violence destroy people's lives and the environment. More than 3 million Ukrainians have become refugees, including many children with an uncertain future. As we lament for the loss of lives and trauma brought by the war, I hope we will redouble our effort to work for peace and solidarity with people who do not have a place called home. We need to pursue a planetary spirituality and work with people of other faiths and people of no faiths for our critical time if we want to have a future for ourselves and the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Professor Kwok. Oh, I have to just take a breath after that. Oh my. We have much to think about, and especially to think about the actions that we will take. But right now, in this moment, we have responses from 4 faculty members of the Department of Theological Studies here at LMU. And also, just hoping that all who are gathered will remember here in our virtual space that we'll also have time for some of your questions as well. So we'll have responses from Dr. Roy Fisher, Dr. Cecilia Gonzalez-Andreu, Dr. Narinjan Khalsa Baker, and Dr. Eric Haruki Swanson. Now, Dr. Fisher is an anthropologist of religion specializing in Second Temple Jewish literature and early Christianity. Dr. Cecilia Gonzalez-Andreu is a theologian and teaches a very popular course called Care of Our Common Home, and she teaches that right here at LMU. Dr. Narinjan Khalsa Baker is a senior instructor in Sikh and Yoga Studies, Indian Religions, and Interreligious Studies. And Dr. Eric Haruki Swanson focuses his research on the esoteric Buddhist tradition in medieval Japan. And he teaches courses in East Asian religion and spirituality at LMU. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our responders, and we'll begin with Dr. Roy Fisher. And remember, everyone, be putting your questions into the chat as you go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kwok, for these thoughtful reflections on planetary spirituality for our time. I'm particularly grateful for your reminder that Christian sacred scripture can indeed be read within a planetary consciousness that decenters human beings. Way back in the 4th century, Augustine reminded his readers in the opening of the Confessions that humans are a tiny part, a particle of creation. And I also find it delightfully apropos that your appeal for humility and self-examination comes in the midst of this Lenten season, when we are called to remember that it is from the humus that we humans have come, and it is to the humus, the soil, that we will return. So thank you very much. Your timely invitation to take up the spiritual practice of reading the Bible with an expansive perspective, an expansive reading, calls to mind for me the work of the late Jesuit scientist and theologian, Teilhard de Chardin, and more recently, the Catholic theologian John Hott, who also remind us that a biblical view of the cosmos is one in which the universe and the planets are much more than stages or backdrops for the human search for meaning and goodness. Our sacred scriptures and traditions are themselves just small beginnings within a vast cosmos that is itself still awakening and becoming. And this part of your talk resonated so deeply and wonderfully with me personally. There's a quote from John Hott that I enjoy as well. He says, "Our religious traditions, since they too have just barely and only ambiguously awakened to the dawning of rightness, remain as far from finished as the universe that carries them." And I think, at least for me, this call to be humble and to be open to learn, to explore from others, and to learn from creation itself is well needed and timely. I wonder if you might comment on how teleological framings, which encourage us to think about an unfinished or becoming cosmos that invites our participation in its own anticipation of the fullness of being, of goodness and beauty, rather than a perspective in which it is a fallen or corrupted cosmos in need of restoration, either our own or divine, might also help us craft more holistic views of planetary spirituality for our time. So that's just one short question that I would have in response. I thank you again for these lovely, thoughtful reflections, and I'll now hand off the conversation to my colleague, Dr. Gonzalez Andrew.
Thank you so much. And I have to admit that I am initially just sad that I can't hug my dear friend Kwok Pui Lan, and to thank her, not only for this amazingly wonderful lecture, but for all of her work. And she is a role model, and she's a generous mentor. And as we work together on the book project that eventually became Teaching Global Theology's Power and Praxis, Pui Lan taught our international group of scholars how to do two things at once that sometimes seem to be opposites. And she taught us to be precise, organized, practical, and at the same time to have an expansive imagination that just explodes borders and boundaries in a radical sense of interplay and also of usness. So thank you for all that, Pui Lan. Now, in this challenging lecture, you give us clarity, right? What is the difference between global and planetary? You give us strategies. How do we change habits? You give us resources, right? Here are other thinkers. Here's research that you need to know. And at the same time, you also give us that impetus to imagine that comes from real wisdom, something I've always recognized in you. Why have we forgotten our religious tradition of lament? Have we grown so heartless that we can't even weep anymore? Why is there such a lack of art centering on nature in the West? Have we shrunk beauty to our small image rather than be awed at the mysterious otherness of all that God gives? What can we learn from Eastern traditions and their imaginative expansiveness? How do we engage our planetary imagination together so that we can see and feel how eons pass and futures come? Professor Kwok's theological proposal is to expand our wisdom, our discernments, and our actions by orienting ourselves toward a natural world that was always at the center of God's imagination, but that we have willfully, tragically, and sinfully neglected and destroyed. She's calling humans to take our humble place with the creation, not at its summit. And although she doesn't use this language, I see a vibrant denunciation of idolatry. How we have made ourselves, our consumerist appetites, and our need for power into destructive idols, beating down the fragility of God's gifts. So if I may ask you for your wisdom, Pui Lan, the last few years have dealt people of goodwill many disappointments. Political polarization threatens our ability to coexist, not only with the planet we victimize, but also with the other humans we victimize. We've found out terrible things about each other. We've been unwilling to help each other through a pandemic, and what should have revealed to us our dependence on each other. And now we make war, sowing destruction everywhere. So here's my question. The human creature seems to no longer believe in its own capacity for goodness. Do you have any thoughts on how we recapture that? Thank you again so much. And now I'm going to turn it over to my very beautiful and loving friend, Niranjan.
Thank you so much. Oh, Dr. Kwok Pui Lan, you've broken my heart with this, and as have you, Cecilia. The time for lament, as I just feel through your words, both of your words, the pain and suffering in the world, and am incredibly inspired as well by the talk that you have just given and this really incredibly beautiful paper and project that you have gifted us. You offer us a meditation, a lament, and a call to awaken our planetary spirituality and our eco-consciousness. And I'm so grateful, like Dr. Roy Fisher, to be here together during the season of Lent, during the season of spring and the Sikh New Year. This is a time of sacrifice and a time of rebirth, as the darkness of winter is giving way to the light of spring. And so it's a time to welcome new life and to sow seeds now so that they can give us a bountiful harvest. Your exquisite paper, it calls us to awaken to the gift of life all around us, as well as the grief within us. To acknowledge how our ego-driven lives have caused irrevocable devastation to our Mother Earth. You invite us to not look away from the pain and the suffering, but to honor it. Acknowledge and see that it's due to our unconscious slumber, that we've been asleep for too long, and we've caused so much harm. Your paper offers us spiritual practices so that we may repair our lost connection to the divine whole and cultivate more balance and harmony with our relationships, with God, ourselves, our communities, and our planet. By meditating, so you offer us these meditations, we meditate on our interconnectedness, we can develop an eco-consciousness, more contemplative awareness, environmental awareness, and by awakening to this consciousness, we can lament and mourn for our shared precarity, our shared suffering, and it also requires accountability to act justly and rightly through harmonious and skillful means. I really appreciate that you refer to this as this eco crisis as a spiritual crisis, that we have to change our behaviors and our habits, our desires, that we have to change our ways of seeing and acting in the world. You offer spiritual practices that integrate our body, our mind, and our spirit, and expand our vision for how we see and experience our own religious traditions, and how we can learn from the wisdoms of other religions and cultures. The first Sikh Guru, Guru Nanak, offers a vision of interconnected oneness, Ik Onkar, that there's this creative energy that enlivens all life. And he too laments our separation from the divine due to our ego-centered nature. And he sings songs of praise, of the wonder and awe that this Mad, for the gift of life all around us. In the air, our teacher, the water, our father, and earth, our mother. Pavan Guru, Pani Pita, Mata Darat Mahat. So as we breathe in, we feel the divine teacher inside of us. As we breathe out, we let go of our separateness. May our breath become a living prayer, connecting our mind, hearts, and spirits with this universal oneness, here and now, and call us to divine action. And now, I would like to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Eric Haruki Swanson.
Thank you so much. It's really difficult to follow such beautiful reflections from all of my colleagues here. And I first want to express my deep gratitude to Professor Kwok for sharing with us her deep and very beautiful reflections on planetary spirituality. She calls us to ask ourselves how we can reevaluate our relationship with our conceptions of God, how we might be more attentive to our connections with both human and non-human species, and with the natural and cosmic order. As someone who focuses their research on East Asian Buddhism, I also deeply appreciated your reflections on learning wisdom interreligiously, specifically as a spiritual practice that helps us to view the world from a multitude of vantage points. And as a spiritual practice, it seems to me that you're suggesting that this isn't something that we should see as confined as a scholarly discourse or a scholarly discipline, but rather something to be cultivated and nurtured, with the real deep implication that this perspective might have a profound effect on who we can be as individuals and how we interact with the world. You also brought our attention to Zhang Zai, an influential Neo-Confucian thinker from the 11th century. What strikes me about Zhang Zai's writings is how his cosmographical insights on heaven and earth has real implications on cultivating a form of ideal personhood, often translated as sagehood. As you quoted today, he says, "Heaven is my father and the earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I find an intimate place in their midst." As this statement so eloquently suggests, for Zhangzai, it's not only one's understanding of heaven and earth, but also one's awareness of their deep relationship with the expansive world that consists both the heavens and the earth. But in addition to the call to be in accordance with this vision of the earth, in his writings, Zhangzai also highlights the responsibility of the ideal sage to share their insight with others. To quote another passage from Zhangzai's writings, he suggests that, quote, "The enterprise of the sage is to be able to comprehend the changes of the world and set them forth before the people," end quote. In another place, he says, "The method of the sage is to follow the changes and shape them in order to teach the world," end quote. The suggestion here, I believe, is that it's not enough just to understand the world better, but to also act upon it in a way to help others also follow the example that they themselves set. I believe this also resonates with your reflections that you shared on faithful action as the fourth spiritual practice. So I have a somewhat selfish question for Professor Kwok today. I wonder if we might reflect on our own roles as scholars of religion in the classroom in thinking about planetary spirituality, not only for our own cultivation as individuals, but also in setting an example for others in our role as teachers. In other words, how might we teach others to cultivate their own planetary awareness and spirituality, particularly in relationship to the spiritual practice of learning wisdom interreligiously, as you introduced to us today? And even if one is not a scholar of religion, what might be some strategies or methods we can use as individuals to encourage others to open themselves up to these spiritual practices, perhaps especially to those who might be reluctant to listen to such perspectives? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and I believe it's a question that might be relevant for many of us here today. So thank you so much again for the really wonderful presentation. So I'd like to turn things back to our moderator, Professor Harris, as we move into the discussion portion of our event. Thank you.
So thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists and for your wonderful questions, and also to invite participants to put questions into the chat, and you can send them directly to Dr. Cecilia, who will be gathering them. So we'll see how that all works out. But I know that we have some amazing questions to begin with from our panelists. And I guess our technical person, Rory, if you could please spotlight Professor Kwok, and we'll begin with these questions that we have from our faculty panel. Thank you. So perhaps it will work if the panelists could repeat their questions. Would that be helpful, Professor Kwok? Oh, you're muted.
For the sake of time, can I just respond briefly instead of just answering direct questions?
Okay, that
yes,
sounds good.
Because I wanted to share with you how different perspectives can be changed or learned from the artistic sensibility. As a teacher of spirituality, I have always used art in my classroom, in my pedagogy. So after my visits to the Museum of Art in New York, I became interested why you have this great contrast between the artistic traditions of Western Europe and also East Asia. Then I found out nature has been portrayed very frequently in Western art as the background, as something that is not the center, very much like our reading of Genesis. And then I found out that I and many others love the art of the Impressionists. And some of us may know Monet and other Impressionists, they were influenced by Japanese art. And in Japanese art, nature has been portrayed so beautifully, vibrant and colorful. To respond to Dr. Fisher's question, can we view creation as vibrant, energetic, and beautiful, and not just as the fallen order? And then the Japanese art form really helped us to appreciate the varieties and shades of color and beauty of nature. That is why Monet built the water lily pond in his home and painted 8 large-scale spots for the water lily project. What is significant is when you look at the water lily that Monet has painted, he borrowed the perspective of Japanese painters. Instead of a Western perspective that you have a focal point, the water lily paintings, you can look at it from all different perspectives or entry points. So next time, when you look at Monet and the Impressionist art, remember this cultural dialogue, changing of perspectives and sensibilities. And that is why, to respond to Dr. Swanson's, how may we encourage students to learn from others? We can learn from others through art, through song, through visiting their house of worship. And there are so many ways. If we encourage our students to appreciate the beauty, the possibilities, the imaginations of so many traditions, we will know we impoverish ourselves by sticking to our own tradition. It's just like going to a buffet. You just eat from one dish. You miss everything else. And so I would encourage us to use all the different medium. And that is why I use song, I use film, I use art to cultivate this expansive sense that we can learn from each other. Dr. Gonzalo Andre asked this question, which is very difficult to answer. How can we still believe the capacity for doing good, given the last several years of the pandemic, and then the ongoing war in Ukraine? I have learned from Black feminist ethicist Tracy West that hope is a process. Yes, when we look at all the challenges, the pandemic really magnifies human vulnerabilities, the kind of oppression we inflicted upon each other and the planet. We sometimes cannot find hopefulness. But hope is not a status. Hope is not even a belief. Hope is a process. Today, we do something for the sake of the planet. We become a little bit more hopeful. When I see so many of us are praying for Ukraine, are doing our best to ask the question, how can we human beings allow such a war to happen in front of our own eyes? When I see vigils on our campus and on other campuses for the war, for the victims of the pandemic, I know that the younger generations, they are mindful, they are paying attention. Hope is difficult, but hope is a process. I am deeply moved by Dr. Kauser's, your response. You echo this deep compassion, not only for human beings, but also for everything God has created. Your feeling with those people who suffered and your call for compassion is really key. Unless we see the beauty of creation, see the beauty of the image of God in each other, and recognize the lost if we destroy it, we cannot collectively express solidarity, express that deep felt love and connection. And with interreligious dialogue, learning wisdom interreligiously, we put on different pairs of lenses. We really need to humble ourselves and put on another pair of lens so that we do not only know from others' wisdom, but we are given the opportunities to see ourselves anew, borrow others' perspective to recover some of the beauty in our tradition that we might have forgotten. In the book, you will see a much longer discussion of my learning to read Psalms anew through reading Chinese poetry. And I hope the audience tonight will have an opportunity to get hold of a copy. It is through reading Chinese poetry I was reminded the beautiful grandeur descriptions of creation in Psalms. So I hope you will have a chance to read the little booklet and look at some of those biblical passages anew. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Now, I hear from Dr. Cecilia, you have some questions, especially from some of our students that have come through to you.
I do. I have a question here from one of our graduate students, and I'm going to read it because it's kind of long, which we want them to do. So they say, Dr. Kwok Pui Lan, could you elaborate more on the statement that you said about reading the Bible from an Eastern philosophical perspective? I think you said this fits with evolutionary theory and more things alongside this as well. Growing up in the United States, in the Southern Bible Belt, I grew up reading the Bible through a very narrow paradigm, a very anthropomorphized way, androcentric way. However, in undergraduate, when I began to study Eastern philosophy, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, etc., it largely shifted the way that I viewed and read the Bible. Of course, I was interpreting the text through a more Eastern paradigm. I've tried to explain this phenomenon to others, and they often don't understand. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on this a bit more, not necessarily about the paradigm process itself, but about the insights of reading the Bible from an Eastern perspective, just what you were talking about. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this question. And I am glad you have the opportunity to learn something about Eastern philosophy and Eastern thought. And reading the Bible from multi-religious point of view, wouldn't it be something that is interesting or imaginative? That you look at it not only from the point of view of what you have inherited. As you know that, I am now teaching in the Bible Belt too, and I have students who share that kind of reading of the Bible, looking at the Bible more literally. But the Bible has so many different genres. I especially like the wisdom literature and the biblical poetry, because some of the poetry, as I said, reminded me of what I have recited. Many Chinese growing up reciting a lot of the poetry. Why? Some of the poetries are very short, okay, with only 20 words. And some of those renowned poetry in 20 or in 28 words can say so much. To come back to your question, how may we read the Bible from a much more expansive point of views, maybe using other philosophical or religious traditions? Now, the Bible, of course, is a depository of wisdom from so many centuries. And then it records the faith and search of meaning of Hebrew people and also early Christians. Some of the questions that they were asking can find relevance in other traditions. Job's question, why? Why innocent people will suffer? Well, we have another poet in China by the name of Ji Yuan, who has also written a lengthy poem. That poem is not asking something about God, it's asking heaven, because he also suffered from exile, from various kinds of oppression. So you can read those two, Job and this poet from China, to see what kind of rationalization they have come up to answer these questions that very few of us have exhausted the answer. Why innocent people suffer? Not only that, we can look at the Bible if we bring the East Asian sensibility. You read the Bible through the point of the earth, from Genesis throughout, and then you will find very interesting, again, echoes with Eastern thought. There is the Green Bible. I don't know whether some of you have seen it. And they highlight all the passages in the Bible that talks about nature or creation. But of course, the Bible, the Green Bible should not be limited just to talk about nature. Human beings are part of nature too. So I invite you to try to look at the Bible through the lens of the earth. Let me cite an example. Jesus' story. Well, when we read Jesus' story, we read it anthropologically. It's all about me, about my salvation. Jesus dies for me. You can read it that way. But borrow the lens from an Eastern perspective, you may see Jesus slightly from a different point of view. Jesus' life was, of course, dependent on the animals, the plants, the people around him. Without those things, you would not have the parables of the sower, of so many things about the lily of the valleys and all these wonderful metaphors. So Jesus lived very closely to the land. Let me also remind you, we Asians consider Palestine as western part of Asia. So then we see that Jesus is deeply rooted in the land. And since in Chinese poetry, in Eastern philosophy, we talk about the beauty of the land, we talk about our dependence of the land. Not only that, in Buddhism, we talk about codependence. And so it is not, we human beings can be separated. Even when you look at Jesus' stories again, you will see the dependence of him on the natural environment, his relationship with the land, with the wilderness, with lands in the border. You begin to see a different Jesus. So there are many ways. I invite you to experiment, to consider the forgotten, or the neglected, or the hidden. Just like Genesis 1 can be read as a duophony. the epiphany of the earth. The Bible, I think, beckons us to read it anew for new epiphanies. Thank you so much for your wonderful question.
Fantastic. I think we might have time for another one if another one has come through to you, Dr. Cecilia.
Yes, I do have another question from one of our guests who is juxtaposing, right, this wonderful conversation we're having about imagination and about beauty and about all of these really enriching and engaging things against this world we're living in, where children are stuck on screens, we're stuck on screens, where electronics have created such a kind of barrier, if you will, and space between us. And so our guest wonders if this is really detrimental to this call that we should have to really engage our imaginations. What do you think about this whole technology question?
Yes, I think that technology offers us many, many good things. We cannot hold a conference without Zoom, for example. But of course, we have spent so many hours on Zoom. Remember last year when everything would be conducted through Zoom? To the extent we have lost touch with other human beings. And that is why when I was able to go back to class, in-person teaching, I was so excited, finally seeing, touching the students, right? And one thing that we have felt a sense of homelessness sometimes is we hardly go out and appreciate nature. So I invite all of you who participate in this particular lecture this week, and take some time, just take a walk, appreciate the wonder of nature, feel the warm sun, walk barefoot on the grass, smell the flower. In Atlanta, the daffodils are already blooming. Stop, pay attention. It is those things that we love, that we want to save. Let the beauty surround you, move you, so that out of that love of the beauty around us, that we commit to do something for ourselves, for future generations, and for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kwok. Oh, okay. So we've been giving our, well, I won't call them marching orders. I'll say our walking orders. Thank you. I'd like to introduce now Professor Theresia DeVrome, who is Professor of English and the Director of the Marymount Institute for Faith, Culture, and the Arts. And of course, she is the editor of the Marymount Institute Press. And Dr. DeVrome has a presentation for you, Professor Kwok. So please, Dr. DeVrome.
I'm Theresia DeVrome. I am the director of the Marymount Institute for Faith, Culture, and the Arts. We're so glad to have you here and to represent the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary in this wonderful lecture. We're giving an honorary gift to Professor Kwok, done by our artist in residence, Will Pupa, and it's called Truth is the Daughter of Time, which is Temporis Filia Veritas. And in it, you see a woman reading a book, the intellectual endeavor, and out of that, a tree is growing behind her. The world that we live in, the natural world, the world that matters, that we have to preserve, that Professor Kwok has so incredibly explained and profoundly thought about in her lecture.
Thank you so much, Professor DeVrome. Well, this has been quite a rich gathering. And there are many thank yous, and we won't go through all of them, but a few things for people to know. In about a week or so, you can watch this lecture again, and that will be up. It'll be on YouTube on the website for Department of Theological Studies. And thank you, especially to all of our technological people that have been helping us out in so many ways. Thank you so much to the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary. And thank you to all of our colleagues in theological studies. Thank you to Dr. Layla Karst, who has been having a watch party with theological studies majors and minors and grad students. And once again, yes, our technical team. Thank you so much to our panelists for those for your incredible reflection and your questions, and especially thank you, Professor Kwok Pui Lan, for giving us so much to think about and to pray about and to do. We certainly appreciate you very, very much. We're glad that so many of you attended our Milligan lecture for 2022, and we're already looking forward to our lecture for 2023. Possibly, hopefully, we will be in person. And our anticipated speaker will be Dr. Mary Catherine Hilkert from the University of Notre Dame.